The weight of precision. The workshop fell silent except for the rhythmic filing of metal against metal. In the dim light of a Leningrad factory, Yevgeny Dragunov bent over his workbench, his calloused fingers tracing the wooden stock of what would become the most influential sniper rifle of the modern era. Outside, the winter of 1958 pressed against the windows like a memory of war itself. He was just a sporting rifle designer, a quiet man who understood the language of wood grain and steel precision. But the Soviet military had come to him with an impossible demand: create a weapon that could reach farther, strike cleaner, and turn ordinary soldiers into marksmen capable of changing the course of battles from distances measured in hundreds of meters. The morning when everything changed began like any other. Dragunov arrived at his workshop before dawn, the Leningrad streets still empty except for the occasional truck carrying workers to the shipyards. Snow crunched under his boots as he unlocked the heavy wooden door, the familiar scent of linseed oil and metal shavings greeting him like an old friend. He had spent 38 years perfecting the art of precision, first as a child, taking apart his grandfather's hunting rifle, then as a young man crafting competition weapons that consistently outperformed their Western counterparts. The knock came at precisely 8 o'clock. 3 men in military greatcoats stood in his doorway, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The eldest, a colonel whose chest bore the ribbons of Stalingrad and Berlin, stepped forward. "Comrade Dragunov, we need to discuss a matter of national importance. The crisis that brought these men to his workshop had been brewing since the end of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower and mass infantry assault, but modern warfare was evolving. American forces in Korea had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of skilled marksmen with precision rifles. Intelligence reports spoke of NATO developing new sniper doctrines that could neutralize Soviet officers, communications personnel, and key targets from ranges that made traditional counterfire impossible. The Red Army's standard Mosin Nagant, a bolt-action relic from another era, could no longer answer the call of contemporary warfare. As the colonel spread classified documents across Dragunov's workbench, the weight of the request became clear. They needed a weapon that could be mass-produced, reliable in the harsh conditions of Soviet frontiers, accurate enough for precision work, yet simple enough for regular infantry to maintain. The rifle had to bridge the gap between the crude reliability of battle rifles and the delicate precision of custom sniper weapons. Dragunov studied the specifications in silence, his mind already calculating tolerances and mechanisms. The requirements seemed contradictory. How could mass production maintain the precision his sporting rifles achieved through meticulous hand-fitting? How could a semi-automatic action provide the accuracy traditionally associated with bolt-action designs? "When do you need this completed?" he asked quietly. "The trials begin in 18 months, the colonel replied. "The motherland is counting on you." As the military men departed, leaving behind a folder marked with state security stamps, Dragunov understood that his life's work had taken an irreversible turn. The boy who once dismantled hunting rifles by candlelight was now tasked with creating a weapon that would shape conflicts across continents. He poured himself a glass of tea from the samovar in the corner, the steam rising in the cold workshop air, and wondered if his mother had been right, that his gifts would inevitably serve a world that demanded weapons rather than tools of peace. That evening, in his small apartment overlooking the Neva River, Dragunov sat at his kitchen table with the classified folder open before him. His wife, Anna, watched him from across the room as she mended one of their daughter's school uniforms. "They want you to build something terrible, don't they?" she said without looking up from her sewing. "They want me to solve a problem," he replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." But as he studied the technical requirements late into the night, Dragunov knew that once this weapon existed, he would never control how his precision would be used. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. How does it feel when the world asks you to perfect something you know will outlive you? Dragunov's childhood in revolutionary Russia had taught him that precision and reliability were not merely technical concepts. They were the difference between life and death, between eating and hunger, between hope and despair. Born in 1920 to a family that understood the weight of survival, he had grown up in the shadow of revolution and war. His father, a metalworker, had died during the civil war that followed the October Revolution. Young Yevgeny learned early that when systems failed, only craftsmanship endured. As a child, he dismantled old hunting rifles with the methodical patience of a surgeon, studying how each component contributed to accuracy. His mother watched him work by candlelight, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her son's gifts would inevitably serve a world that demanded weapons rather than tools of peace. The rifles he took apart bore the marks of imperial craftsmen, men who had understood that a weapon's soul lay not in its appearance, but in the harmony between its parts. Now, in the winter of 1958, those childhood lessons guided his approach to the military's impossible request. The first prototypes failed spectacularly. The gas-operated mechanism, adapted from the successful AK-47 platform, generated vibrations that destroyed accuracy at long range. Military testers dismissed his early attempts as a hunting rifle, pretending to be a military weapon. Senior designers at other bureaus whispered that Dragunov was out of his depth, that sporting rifle expertise meant nothing in the unforgiving realm of military requirements. Each failure struck him personally. During late nights in his Leningrad workshop, with snow building against the windows, Dragunov would disassemble the failed prototypes and study where his calculations had gone wrong. The semi-automatic action that made the rifle practical for military use created mechanical vibrations that disrupted the precise barrel harmonics necessary for long-range accuracy. It was like asking an orchestra to play a symphony while marching. The movement itself destroyed the music. The problem, he explained to his assistant Victor one morning, is that we're trying to make the metal sing while it's dancing. Victor, a young machinist who had served in Korea, understood the implications better than most. The Americans have something we don't, he said quietly. Their M1C conversions hit our officers at ranges where we couldn't return fire. The pressure from Moscow intensified as months passed without breakthrough. Reports from military advisors in various conflicts painted a troubling picture. Western forces were developing precision fire capabilities that could neutralize key personnel before Soviet forces could even locate the threat. The new weapon needed to democratize accuracy, allowing ordinary soldiers to engage targets at distances that had previously required years of specialized training. Working 16-hour days, Dragunov obsessed over harmonics, barrel vibration, and the subtle interaction between the semi-automatic action and bullet flight. He studied captured NATO weapons, analyzed metallurgy reports, and even consulted with musicians from the Leningrad Philharmonic about vibration dampening. The breakthrough came not from advanced engineering, but from an almost mystical understanding of how metal and wood could be made to sing in harmony. One evening in March 1959, as spring began to touch the ice-covered Neva, Dragunov found his answer. Instead of fighting the weapon's mechanical rhythm, he would work with it. He redesigned the gas system to create a more controlled recoil impulse, modified the barrel attachment to isolate vibrations, and crafted a stock that absorbed rather than transmitted the mechanical noise of the action. The wood became a tuning fork, calibrated to dampen rather than amplify unwanted frequencies. The solution required him to think like both engineer and artist. Each rifle would need individual adjustment, a marriage of mass production techniques with the sensitivity of custom work. It was a compromise that satisfied neither purists nor pragmatists, but it might just work. As he prepared for the next round of trials, Dragunov received a letter from his brother Pavel, stationed with Soviet advisors in North Africa. The letter spoke carefully of technical challenges and equipment inadequacies, but between the lines, Dragunov read frustration and loss. Somewhere beyond the reach of official reports, Soviet soldiers were dying because they lacked the tools to fight on equal terms. "We make do with what we have," Pavel wrote, "but the enemy sees us before we see them." That night, Dragunov dreamed of his father's hands, steady and scarred from years of metalwork, shaping tools that would outlast the man who made them. Where does the responsibility end for those who create the tools that others must use? By the 1950s, Dragunov had established himself as a master of sporting rifles, creating competition weapons that dominated international tournaments. His rifles bore distinctive signatures, a particular weight distribution that felt natural in skilled hands, a trigger mechanism that broke cleanly at precisely the right pressure, wood stocks that seemed to grow from the metal rather than merely housing it. When Soviet marksmen won gold medals in Helsinki and Melbourne, they did so with weapons that bore his quiet craftsmanship. But when military representatives arrived at his workshop with classified requirements for a designated marksman rifle, he faced a moral labyrinth that would haunt him for decades. The technical challenge was only part of the burden. Creating a weapon meant accepting responsibility for every life it would touch, both those who would wield it and those who would face it. The spring trials of 1960 approached with the tension of a chess match between superpowers. Dragunov's latest prototype, now designated SVD-001, would compete against designs from other Soviet bureaus. The testing ground outside Moscow buzzed with the controlled energy of military evaluation. Officers with stopwatches and clipboards measured not just accuracy but maintenance time, reliability under stress, and the speed with which ordinary soldiers could learn to use each weapon effectively. The SVD performed beyond expectations. At 400 meters, it consistently placed shots within a 4-inch circle using standard military ammunition. More importantly, it maintained this accuracy after being buried in mud, frozen overnight, and subjected to the kind of abuse that destroyed more delicate systems. The rifle could be partially disassembled and cleaned by any soldier with basic training, yet it delivered precision that had previously required custom-built weapons and specialist maintenance. Colonel Markov, the senior evaluator, approached Dragunov as the trials concluded. "Your rifle changes everything," he said quietly. "Do you understand what this means?" Dragunov nodded, watching young conscripts strip and reassemble his design with increasing confidence. In their hands, the weapon ceased to be his creation and became something larger, a tool that would reshape how Soviet forces fought and how their enemies responded. The first production order called for 5,000 rifles. Within months, reports began filtering back from conflicts where Soviet influence extended. The SVD appeared in Vietnam, where North Vietnamese forces used it to counter American sniper teams. It surfaced in the Middle East, Africa, and anywhere the Cold War played out in proxy conflicts. Each photograph of his creation in foreign hands deepened Dragunov's understanding of what he had unleashed. Letters from Pavel became more frequent and more cryptic. "The new equipment changes the conversation," he wrote from Syria. "Now we can speak the same language as our opponents." Anna noticed the change in her husband first. He spent longer hours at the workshop, not because of work demands, but because he needed the rhythm of creation to balance the weight of consequence. She would find him sometimes, late at night, sitting at their kitchen table with a glass of tea grown cold, staring at newspapers that carried reports from distant conflicts. "Do you regret it?" she asked one evening as snow fell outside their apartment window. "I solved the problem they presented to me," he replied. Nothing more, nothing less. But his dreams told a different story. In sleep he saw his rifle in countless hands, young soldiers who reminded him of Pavel, veterans whose eyes carried too much knowledge, revolutionaries who believed their cause justified any means. The weapon had become more than metal and wood. It was a force multiplier that extended Soviet tactical doctrine across continents. The SVD redefined the role of the designated marksman, creating a new category of soldier who operated between the traditional rifleman and the specialized sniper. Squad-level precision fire became standard in armies that adopted the rifle, fundamentally altering infantry tactics and urban warfare. The weapon's reliability meant that precision fire was no longer the exclusive domain of elite units. Ordinary soldiers could now engage targets at ranges that had previously required specialized equipment and extensive training. As 1961 dawned, Dragunov received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Red Cross representative investigating weapons proliferation, arrived at his workshop with questions that cut deeper than any technical specification. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "about the families on the other side of your rifle's scope?" The question lingered long after her departure. That night, Dragunov found himself thinking not about mechanical tolerances or production schedules, but about the moment when precision became personal, when his abstract problem-solving touched real lives in ways he could never control or predict. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When does solving a technical problem become accepting moral responsibility? The summer trials of 1963 changed everything. On a range outside Moscow, the SVD, Sniperskaya Vintovka Dragunova, consistently placed shots within a 4-inch circle at 400 meters using standard military ammunition. More importantly, it maintained this accuracy after being buried in mud, frozen overnight, and subjected to the kind of abuse that destroyed more delicate systems. The rifle could be partially disassembled and cleaned by any soldier with basic training, yet it delivered precision that had previously required custom-built weapons and specialist maintenance. But as production ramped up to meet military demands, Dragunov began receiving reports that transformed his understanding of what he had created. The weapon appeared not just in Soviet hands, but in conflicts across the globe. Intelligence photographs showed his rifle in jungles of Southeast Asia, in the hands of fighters whose causes he barely understood. Each image carried the weight of unintended consequences. Major Volkov, the military liaison assigned to monitor SVD deployment, visited Dragunov's workshop monthly with updates that read like dispatches from a world the designer barely recognized. In Vietnam, designated marksmen armed with SVDs were countering American sniper teams with devastating effectiveness. In the Middle East, the rifle's reliability in desert conditions made it the weapon of choice for long-range precision fire. In Africa, revolutionary movements adopted the SVD as both practical tool and symbol of sophisticated resistance. "Your rifle has become something more than a weapon," Volkov explained during one grey afternoon in Leningrad. "It's changing how wars are fought." The transformation went beyond military tactics. The SVD democratized precision in ways that military planners hadn't anticipated. Where previously long-range accuracy required months of specialized training, the rifle's design allowed ordinary soldiers to engage targets effectively at distances that had once belonged exclusively to elite snipers. This shift fundamentally altered the mathematics of infantry combat. Dragunov found himself studying maps of conflicts he had never expected to influence. Reports from military advisors described how the weapon's presence changed enemy behavior, how opposing forces had to modify their tactics, adjust their movement patterns, and invest in countermeasures that hadn't been necessary before. The rifle had become a strategic factor that extended far beyond its immediate tactical application. At home, the weight of this knowledge settled into his daily routine. Anna noticed how he paused longer over newspaper reports from distant conflicts, searching between the lines for mentions of precision fire or sniper activity. Their daughter, now in university, sometimes found her father standing at their apartment window, looking out over the Neva River with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Dr. Chen returned in late 1963, carrying photographs that made the abstract concrete. Images of civilians caught in crossfire, of soldiers barely older than boys, of families displaced by conflicts where precision weapons had changed the rules of engagement. Every innovation has unintended consequences, she said quietly. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Dragunov studied the photographs in silence. In one image, a young soldier, perhaps 19 years old, held an SVD with the casual competence that suggested months of training. The boy's face carried an expression Dragunov recognized from his own mirror, the weight of responsibility for precision, the knowledge that accuracy meant consequence. "I never taught them to hate," he said finally. "I only taught the metal to sing true." "But someone else decides what song it sings," Chen replied. That evening, Dragunov received a letter from Pavel that carried news both personal and professional. His brother had been wounded in an incident that officially never happened, in a place Soviet forces officially didn't operate. Between the careful language of censorship, Dragunov read that Pavel's survival had depended on equipment superiority, on having tools that matched those used by his opponents. "The new rifle saved my unit," Pavel wrote. "When they found our position, we could answer at the same range. Without that, none of us would have made it home." The letter forced Dragunov to confront the duality of his creation. The same precision that enabled violence also enabled survival. The weapon that took lives also preserved them. The tool that escalated conflicts also protected those who wielded it. There was no moral arithmetic that could balance these equations, only the recognition that innovation always carried unintended weight. As 1964 began, production of the SVD reached industrial scale. The Izhevsk factory where the rifles were manufactured operated 3 shifts, turning out weapons that would appear in conflicts Dragunov could never predict. Each rifle bore his design signature, but none carried instructions for moral use. That responsibility belonged to others, to commanders who deployed the weapons, to soldiers who aimed them, to politicians who decided where they would serve. Late one night, as snow fell heavily over Leningrad, Dragunov sat in his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had made his precision possible. The files that shaped metal, the gauges that measured tolerances, the wooden blocks from which stocks were carved, all the instruments of creation that had birthed something beyond his control. How many unintended consequences can one innovation carry before its creator becomes complicit in all of them? As decades passed, Dragunov watched his creation evolve beyond its original purpose. The rifle appeared in the hands of freedom fighters and oppressors alike, defending Soviet interests in some conflicts while opposing them in others. Each photograph, each intelligence report, each news dispatch added another layer to his understanding of what he had unleashed upon the world. The revelation came in 1968, delivered by Colonel Markov in a manila envelope marked with security classifications that made even discussion dangerous. Inside were deployment statistics, casualty analyses, and strategic assessments that painted a picture Dragunov had never been meant to see. The SVD hadn't simply filled a tactical gap in Soviet capabilities, it had fundamentally altered the calculus of modern warfare. "Your rifle has been used in 43 different conflicts," Markov said quietly. "By our allies, by our enemies, by groups whose ideology we don't support and whose existence we don't officially acknowledge." The documents revealed the weapon's true impact. In Vietnam, both North Vietnamese forces and captured weapons in enemy hands had forced American military doctrine to evolve. In the Middle East, the rifle's proliferation had triggered an arms race in precision weapons that reshaped regional conflicts. In Africa, revolutionary movements had adopted the SVD as both practical tool and powerful symbol of technological sophistication. But the most disturbing revelation lay in the final pages of the report. The weapon's reliability and ease of manufacture had made it a preferred choice for arms dealers and proxy conflicts. Nations that couldn't afford advanced military technology could still field effective precision marksmen. The SVD had democratized long-range accuracy in ways that military planners had never anticipated, and not always in service of Soviet interests. "We created a weapon for our soldiers," Dragunov said slowly. "But we armed the world." Markov nodded grimly. "The Americans have their own version now, improved based on lessons learned from facing yours. The British are developing something similar. Within 5 years, every major military will field designated marksman rifles based on principles your design proved effective." The irony was bitter and complete. Dragunov's solution to Soviet tactical disadvantage had triggered innovations that eroded that very advantage. The weapon created to protect Soviet forces had taught their enemies how to build better tools for precision warfare. That night, Dragunov couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty streets of Leningrad, past buildings that bore scars from the Great Patriotic War, toward the factory district where his original workshop had stood. The city around him carried the weight of survival, the knowledge that innovation and destruction were often indistinguishable in their consequences. He found himself thinking of his father, dead these 47 years, whose metalworking tools had first taught him the relationship between precision and purpose. What would the old man have made of a son whose craftsmanship had spread across continents, touching conflicts the metalworker could never have imagined? Dr. Chen appeared at his workshop 3 days later, carrying news that completed the moral circle. The Red Cross had documented the SVD's use in conflicts where humanitarian law should have protected civilians. The weapon's accuracy, which Dragunov had seen as a technological achievement, had enabled targeting that previous generations of weapons couldn't accomplish. "Precision can be mercy," she said carefully. "An accurate shot can end a threat without collateral damage, but it can also enable killing at distances that remove the human element from the equation." "I never taught them to target civilians," Dragunov protested. "No," Chen agreed, "but you taught the weapon to hit whatever target they chose. The moral choice was always theirs. The technical capability is yours." The weight of that distinction settled over him like winter fog over the Neva. He had solved an engineering problem with characteristic Russian thoroughness, creating a weapon that performed exactly as specified. But specifications couldn't account for human nature, political complexity, or the way innovations escaped their creators' intentions. In the weeks that followed, Dragunov began receiving letters from unexpected sources. Veterans who had used his rifle wrote to thank him for equipment that had brought them home alive. Families of soldiers killed by SVDs wrote to condemn the precision that had taken their loved ones. Medical personnel described treating wounds that bore the signature of accurate, long-range fire. Each letter forced him to confront the reality that his creation had become larger than its designer. The SVD existed independently now, in thousands of copies across dozens of conflicts, serving purposes he had never intended and enabling outcomes he had never considered. The rifle had transcended its original specifications and become something approaching a force of history itself. Anna found him one evening in their kitchen, surrounded by opened letters and newspaper clippings, his tea grown cold in its glass. "You can't carry responsibility for every bullet," she said gently. "But I can't pretend they don't exist either," he replied. "What happens when your finest work becomes something you never intended it to be?" He never spoke publicly about the moral weight of his achievement, But those who knew him described a man who carried the quiet burden of understanding that his pursuit of technical perfection had altered the calculus of human conflict. In his final years, Dragunov returned to sporting rifles, crafting competition weapons with the same meticulous care that had defined his military work. When asked about his legacy, he would simply say that he had solved the problem presented to him. Nothing more, nothing less. The transformation was subtle, but profound. Colleagues at the Izhevsk Design Bureau noticed how Dragunov approached each new project with questions that hadn't concerned him in earlier decades. Where once he had focused purely on technical specifications, he now asked about intended use, deployment doctrine, and potential for proliferation. The engineer who had once seen problems as abstract challenges now understood that solutions carried consequences beyond their immediate application. In 1975, a young designer named Alexei Sudayev joined Dragunov's team to work on civilian hunting rifles. Sudayev had studied the SVD's development as part of his engineering training and expected to work with a man consumed by technical innovation. Instead, he found a designer obsessed with precision's moral dimension. Every tolerance we set, every mechanism we design, every choice we make about reliability or accuracy, someone will live or die because of those decisions, Dragunov told him during one of their late-night design sessions. We cannot pretend that metal doesn't remember what hands have held it. The SVD's proliferation continued throughout the 1970s and 1980s, appearing in conflicts that bore no resemblance to the Cold War scenarios that had motivated its creation. The weapon turned up in civil wars, terrorist attacks, and regional conflicts where Soviet involvement was minimal or non-existent. Each appearance reminded Dragunov that innovation, once released, followed its own logic rather than its creator's intentions. Dr. Chen visited him for the final time in 1987, carrying photographs that documented the SVD's role in conflicts across 3 decades. The images told a story of technological diffusion that military planners had never anticipated, a precision weapon designed for state-level warfare that had become a tool of non-state actors, revolutionary movements, and criminal organizations. Your rifle outlived the problems it was created to solve, she observed. It's become part of the permanent landscape of conflict. Dragunov studied the photographs without comment. In one image, a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, held an SVD with competence that suggested extensive training. Her face carried an expression of determined purpose that reminded him of Soviet marksmen he had watched during weapon trials decades earlier. The technology had transcended its original context entirely. I used to think that precision was morally neutral, he said finally. That accuracy was simply accuracy, regardless of purpose. But precision in the wrong hands is still precision. And in the right hands, Chen asked. I'm no longer certain I can tell the difference, he admitted. The Soviet Union that had commissioned the SVD began showing signs of internal strain that would lead to its dissolution. Dragunov watched the political transformation with the detached interest of a man whose life's work had already escaped the ideology that birthed it. His rifle would outlive the state that created it, continuing to serve in conflicts that had nothing to do with communist revolution or capitalist containment. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War entered its final phase, Dragunov received an unexpected letter from America. A veteran of the Vietnam War, a former sniper who had faced SVD-equipped opponents, wrote to express grudging respect for the weapon's design while condemning its use against American forces. Your rifle cost us good men, the veteran wrote, but it was a soldier's weapon, built by someone who understood what soldiers needed. I can hate what it did while respecting how well it did it. The letter forced Dragunov to confront the strange intimacy between creator and user that transcended political boundaries. His precision had touched lives on all sides of ideological conflict, creating connections he had never intended and could never control. He died in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union dissolved, leaving behind a weapon that would outlive the ideology it was created to serve. The SVD remains in service across dozens of nations, its distinctive silhouette recognizable on battlefields from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. But perhaps the true legacy of Yevgeny Dragunov lies not in the weapon itself, but in the reminder that behind every tool of war stands a human mind, complete with hopes, fears, and the terrible responsibility of shaping how others live and die. Anna found his final notebook after the funeral, filled with technical drawings for hunting rifles that would never be built. On the last page, written in his careful engineer's script, were lines that revealed how completely he had come to understand the weight of precision. The metal remembers what I taught it, but not why I taught it. In the end, it wasn't the rifle that defined the man, but the man who dared to perfect what the world demanded, knowing he could never control how his precision would be used. The notebook also contained a letter he had never sent, addressed to all the soldiers who had carried his rifle into conflicts he had never imagined. I gave you precision. Whether you used it for protection or destruction was never my choice to make. I can only hope that when you aimed, you remembered that your target was someone's son, someone's father, someone who might have chosen differently if the world had offered different choices. The responsibility was always yours. I just made sure the rifle shot true. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What legacy do we leave when our finest work serves purposes we never intended?